Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. Today we're talking about Argentina. Right-wing libertarian Javier Milei came to power 2 years ago in Argentina, and he's somebody who's admired by Trump, who wants to have more leaders like him in Latin America. And Milei also just won the midterm elections, I believe, last month, even though there's been a drastic drop in living standards for the working masses. And Argentina, if our listeners didn't know, is home to some of the largest Trotskyist parties in the world. So to find out what led to the rise of Milei, why the left isn't as successful as we think it ought to be, we're going to dig into what's going on in the country and, as always, dig into what are the tasks for socialists on the ground. So to do this, I'm joined today by Comrades Julia and Leticia, who are on the ground in Buenos Aires. Hola, comrades.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having us.
So you've been in Argentina. You've done some work on Argentina. So why don't you start by helping us to understand what's the situation? Tell us about Milei's Argentina.
Okay, well, Milei has been in power for 2 years, and Argentina really has been ground zero for the right-wing shift that we see in world politics globally. But he came to power promising basically neoliberal shock therapy, modeling himself explicitly on Margaret Thatcher, which is a provocation in itself in Argentina, given that Thatcher
For sure
waged the war over the Falklands, Malvinas, and basically promising drastic austerity and neoliberalism. It's fully aligned behind U.S. policy and committed to repaying billions of debt owed to the IMF, World Bank, and other imperialist financial institutions, and has basically overseen a dramatic drop in living standards in the 2 years that it's been in power. I mean, the question is, why did Milei actually come to power? When he came to power, the Argentinian economy was in total shambles. Inflation was at an annual rate of almost 300%. Prices went up by the day, and the economy was in total ruins. So he came to power promising to control inflation, and he has to some degree done that, in the sense that inflation now is at what they call a low rate of 20% annually, which is still pretty enormous by any standards. But the election of Milei was a reaction to years of bourgeois nationalist Peronist governments. The Peronists are the bourgeois nationalist opposition who did nothing to actually develop the country and improve people's living standards over that period. So people voted for the right wing because they saw it as the only alternative to try and change something in the economy. And since then, Milei has been dramatically slashing funding for provinces, for education, for retirement, social services, subsidies. There have been massive layoffs and a dramatic drop in everybody's living standards. So the social crisis in this country is very palpable, and there has been a real collapse in social services and living standards.
I've got a question. I've got a coworker who's Argentinian, and I was trying to talk to him about Argentina, whose family obviously still lives in Argentina. And, I think oftentimes there's a tendency to assume that, okay, there's this right winger. So people who support this right winger are themselves crazy right wingers, But talking to this person, he's very clear. I mean, exactly what you're saying, that it's really because people were sick of the country being a total economic basket case and they wanted a change. So that helps. But my question is, so you've mentioned he's come in, he's been really taking a chainsaw to a lot of just spending, public spending, but he just won the midterms again. Does that seem to be a contradiction in terms? How come he's still retained the support of people?
Well, the main thing to know is the midterm elections took place under the open blackmail of the United States government in the person of Trump, who threatened Argentina that they would not get a $20 billion IMF loan if the population did not vote for Milei in the midterm elections. So the sentiment that we've encountered is that people did not want to vote for Milei, but they were afraid that if they didn't get the IMF loan, the economic situation in Argentina would just get dramatically worse and hyperinflation would return. And so the sentiment what we've encountered is people have said he got a lot of support simply because people did not want a return to the economic situation 2 years ago, and they thought not voting for him would be worse than voting for him.
And there's some talk about how he needs time supposedly to fix things. I mean, Argentina has gone back and forth from Peronists to other governments kind of for 70 years or so, and nothing ever works. Everybody knows that it's always been, bad for workers. So they're kind of like desperate and kind of willing to see if something different is going to work. But the central thing just now was with the U.S. Trump pressuring people that they're going to be worse off now if they don't vote for Milei's party.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Argentina, look, we're talking about Latin America in general, what the US sees as its, quote, backyard. So we can't approach Argentina and its economic situation, or just generally anything about the country, without taking into account like US imperialism and its control on the economy and why that's driven it down. And it's really a tragedy that, again, because of that blackmail, that's actually what's sustaining Milei. But I want to rewind a little bit and go back to, Julia, what you were saying earlier about decades of Peronists sort of mismanagement of the economy. Tell us a little bit about what is Peronism? Who are the Peronists? What are they all about?
Well, the Peronists start with Juan Perón, who was president from 1946 to 1955. He had been Minister of Labor before then. But basically, it was a period in which workers had codified in legislation and in a new constitutional amendments a lot of gains for workers about union rights. And there was also Perón pushed industrialization, benefits for the working class and the unions. And he had a stance that was anti-US and anti-British. So he was a bourgeois populist, but what people today still see in that period are different labor gains that were implemented at that time. And things like public university education is still free. Milei is totally attacking that now, but it's something that began under Perón. Women got the right to vote in 1947 during Perón's presidency. Well, those are things that people really feel in their lives.
So, yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I mean, I'm not sure about the gains so much, but it reminds me a little bit what we often see in terms of parties or figureheads being sort of the central forces who are perceived to be as like the, bring modernization or gains to the people. I think you often see that in semi-colonial former colonies. Obviously, I'm talking about the Congress here and the illusions that in the Indian left or India in general when it comes to Nehru or somebody like that. So I can see that Perón is kind of that figure. So are the Peronistas, they're organized into political parties? Is it like one main party? Are there different parties? Is this the main opposition? What exactly is the state
kind
of the Peronista?
Lots of parties, and Peronismo is also somewhat fragmented, but the Justicialista party is the central one, and it's because it's called that because it stands for social justice is where the name came from. But there's Cristina Fernandez, who's the previous president. She's kind of viewed as more the left wing. There's other figures that are from the right wing that have also like won different, or who's currently in the province of Buenos Aires, the governor. So there are tensions among them as well, not just the left.
Okay, cool. So after 2 years of Milei, what has been the response to all these attacks that he's raining down on people? What are the Peronistas doing? What about the unions, actually? Also, I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. So, I don't know, we can start anywhere you like.
Well, all the main unions in the country are actually under the control of the Peronists. And to be honest, there have been a few one-day general strikes, and there have been some partial isolated strikes But in general, the amount of mobilization has been extremely low, despite huge anger among the base of the unions. So the question we always ask people is, why isn't there more mobilizations? And really, the answer is that the Peronists themselves have a perspective of social dialogue with the government. They agree with Milei that the foreign debt is going to have to be repaid, and the foreign debt determines everything in Argentina. So if they start from that point, the perspective they have, they disagree with Milei on how that's going to be done. But they call for social dialogue, and they accept the idea that the workers are going to have to give up something. All we have to do is negotiate just how much. So if you start from that perspective, that explains why they haven't organized any kind of serious mobilizations. And to give you an idea, when they call a general strike in Argentina, everything shuts down, like banks, transport, industry, everything. Every place where there's unions, and even some where there aren't unions, shut down. So they can be very effective. And the problem isn't that they don't know how to wage struggle. They do know how to call very effective mobilizations. And they have the allegiance of the overwhelming majority of the organized working class. The problem really is one of political perspective. Their perspective is that they need to seek a solution by negotiating with the government.
Well, you said that they still hold the overwhelming allegiance of the working class. But I was thinking that if there's huge anger amongst the base, yet the union tops who are Peronistas, if they agree, okay, well, we need to pay the foreign debt, we just differ with Milei in terms of how, or, how much a tax, or how, how they're meted out, etc. Like, is a contradiction between the sentiments at the base amongst the rank and file and the tops, is that evident? Is that something that sort of comes across when you're doing work on the ground?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, there is some, but there's a lot of looking to their leaders in the unions, and looking to Peronism in general, because it is the Peronists that really are the ones that put forward a call for La Patria no se vende, which means, the country will not be sold. We're not going to sell off the country, which is exactly what Milei is doing. So,
right, okay.
I think that is now probably one of the biggest pulls for the Peronists, that people see them as the ones who are saying, no, it's our country. We have to stop this guy who's, selling it and giving it away.
Yeah, just to give you an idea, in exchange for these loans and bailouts that Argentina is getting from the United States, Milei has opened huge areas of the economy to total imperialist exploitation. For example, extraction of minerals. They've forced Argentina to remove restrictions on imports so that cheap U.S. products can be imported. And the result is shutdowns in local industry here with massive layoffs. So there is a really felt reaction among the population that they don't want, the Argentinian airline or, major mineral industries to simply be sold off to the imperialists and the country's resources to be extracted with no benefit to the Argentinian population. And that is a really valid sentiment that communists have to fight. That communists have to fight for the country to be able to retain its national sovereignty and against this imperialist penetration. And if you don't recognize that this is one of the bases of support of the Peronists, you're not going to be able to win the allegiance of the working class away from its misleaders, who are, while using this sentiment, doing nothing to actually attack. They have no intention to actually attack the interests of either the national bourgeoisie or the imperialists in terms of the bottom line. They do not have a perspective of making a definitive break with imperialism.
It's very interesting. So the Peronists want to defend Argentina, which is correct, as you lay out.
Yes.
But they don't do anything to really defend Argentina. Is that a good way to sum it up?
Well,
or is that too crude?
The leadership of the unions indeed have betrayed over the last period in basically allowing Milei to push through all of his measures attacking previous rights and stuff. The unions do, on occasion, not very frequently in 2 years. I don't know, there's been maybe 4 one-day strikes or something. So they do, have this posture like they're fighting every once in a while, but in actual fact, they allow the Malay's government to carry out his basic destruction of social services and union rights.
Yeah, I'd say in summary that like huge areas, huge gains have been attacked in Argentina, such as universities. University funding has been slashed. Public health has been drastically slashed. Social programs, many of them have been eliminated. And the union leadership has allowed this to happen without any sustained fight against it. They have openly betrayed the interests of their own members. And, they can wage a very effective and very large one-day strike, but the next day everybody is back at work. And so the government has nothing to fear from that kind of strategy, because they know that this is a blow-off steam tactic, but it doesn't actually amount to a real challenge to the current order.
It's a very interesting dynamic you're painting, because, again, in my head, the next question is, but then don't workers see this and aren't they like, well, they're not doing enough, so... But there's still the allegiance because of what Peronism represents, I guess.
There is the allegiance because of what Peronism represents. Like, workers tell us openly that you have to understand that a lot of what we have today, there is still, for example, healthcare, there's benefits for retirees. They've been drastically attacked, but there remain a number of benefits. And there is the perception that the Peronists are fighting against imperialism. So they say, well, the Peronists are the only people who are going to fight for these things. And the strategy that the Peronists are putting forward is to put all their faith in the 2027 presidential elections, i.e. that if you elect a Peronist government in 2027, Milei's attacks will be brought to a halt in that manner. So it's through the legal process, through the democratic process. And that's a very deadly illusion, because one of the reasons Milei came to power in the first place is that workers really were sick and tired of Peronist governments that drove the economy into the ground, and they do not want a return to that situation.
The other part of it is the left, the revolutionary left.
I was going to get to that, because the big question is, there seem to be these contradictions. What about the left? What is it doing? Because, as I said at the start, Argentina is home to some parties that have thousands of members. You don't see that so often, especially when it comes to Trotskyists. So yeah, let's get into the left. Like, what are they saying? Tell us about the left.
Well, the Trotskyists are actually quite a significant, sizable portion of the left. And even, for instance, had a presidential candidate in the 23 elections. There's been now for some time, probably going on 20 years or so, a Frente de Izquierda y de Trabajadores Unidad, which is called the FITU, which is a electoral front of 4 Trotskyist parties, the PTS, who are maybe people know, Left Voice, for instance, in the U.S. They're in the same international organization. There's Partido Obrero, which comes from the tradition starting originally from Jorge Altamira, but also the Piquetero movement, which we're known of like some 20-odd years ago. Also Izquierda Socialista and MST, which comes from the Morenoite tendency, which probably don't have time to get into all of those, the particular differences, but they're all in this frente for the elections. In reality, they sort of fall into, and there are tens of thousands of members in these organizations, and they've received millions of votes. I mean, 1 or 2 millions of votes. In elections, national elections and provincial elections. And some of them, for instance, voted for the Peronista candidate in the elections to fight Milei. And these Trotskyist groups in Argentina tend to fall into the 2 poles of some capitulate directly to Peronismo, to fight the right and in the name of anti-imperialism, and then others, responding to this capitulation, go kind of to the other extreme, saying things like, not putting the fight against imperialism at the center, like saying, they see the capitulation to the native bourgeoisie from some sectors, and then they turn around and basically act like the Argentine bourgeoisie is the main enemy, and they do not put the fight against imperialism at the center of their work. We've even had people who, tell us that La Patria no se vende is nationalist, and therefore
defending the nation.
That you can't, the slogan that the country shouldn't be sold, that's, nationalist, and therefore revolutionaries cannot, have to be against that.
Right. I mean, the Argentine Trotskyists are hardly unique in this. We see these two poles throughout the global South. You either block with the progressive wing to fight the far right, or you denounce the bourgeoisie altogether. But in doing so, you're basically capitulating to imperialism. I wanted to bring the discussion to the actual question of defending the nation, because we wrote an article in Spartacist, I think it's a couple of issues ago, where we said to defeat Milei, you have to fight for national liberation. So how should communists approach this actual question of La Patria? Sorry, I don't know the slogan, but the defending the nation. Like, why is it nationalist? Why is it not nationalist? What should the attitude be? I'd like to give our listeners a sense of that, to understand, that there's a reason why the Trotskyist groups in Argentina, though they're significant and large, there seems to be this problem that prevents them from really taking advantage of the situation and mobilizing more of the masses.
Well, yeah. I mean, this attitude, these two poles of the Trotskyists basically ends up with, I think you said it, of being a capitulation to imperialism, precisely, because the masses are left following the Peronistas because there's no real alternative leadership that can win workers away from the Peronistas. And that's the real horrible result of all of this. Is you look from outside to Argentina and you see this huge left, and you see this also pretty sizable, organized, working class that have been quite combative in different periods. But there's like this huge gap. So how do you close that gap? Unfortunately, despite its size, the Trotskyist organizations don't do that. And I think the central thing is not putting the question, unless they directly capitulate to the Peronists, the ones that don't put the question of anti-imperialism. Because if you don't do that, how are you going to really advance anything in the country if the imperialists are the ones that are basically taking all of the resources away from the country?
Yeah, the basic underlying problem is that the Trotskyist groups tend to make a counterposition between the fight for national liberation and the fight for social revolution, and think that either you fight for one or you fight for the other. But the real question is, a country like Argentina cannot undergo substantial development or substantial social progress absent a confrontation with imperialism. And the fight for national liberation is in no way counterposed to the fight for socialist revolution. In fact, this struggle should be the motor force for the fight for socialist revolution, simply because the national bourgeoisie has every intention of maintaining its connections at the end of the day with the imperialists. However, at the same time, when the imperialists make, very aggressive demands, they can, like the Peronistas do, rely on the working masses as a counterbalance. That's kind of the dynamic in third world countries. So that's the kind of shift that we see. But really the question here is that the fight for national liberation must be at the center of the work of Trotskyists. And if they fail to do that, they will not be able to win the working class.
Thanks for laying that out. I want to talk about the Trotskyists a little bit more. Leticia, you mentioned the huge gap between the unions and the left and how to close that gap. You guys have been to some of the big demonstrations that have happened in Buenos Aires in the recent period. Like, what does that look like on the ground? What are the sort of arguments you're confronted with, when it comes to the left? Because one thing I think I've heard is that there's always sort of separate contingents, separate demonstrations, and that there is a real bad relationship between the unions and the Trotskyist left.
Yeah, there are separate contingents. Sometimes there are even separate demos on, for instance, May Day. This year, the May Day demos were even on different days. I can't remember which one did May 1st and which did April 30th, but it was pretty ridiculous. Arguments that you have, for instance, we put out a call about a year and a half ago for a front to unite. I can't remember the exact phrase, but to unite, to struggle against Milei and to fight against imperialism.
I've actually got the leaflet on the fridge here. Yeah, it's going to be in Spanish. Despierten, but I think it was por un frente de lucha contra el saqueo nacional.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Yeah.
For
no worries.
A front for a fight against basically ripping off the country. Yeah. And there we had, calls that pretty much everybody would agree with, against paying the foreign debt, renationalizing all the privatized things, having your salaries rise with inflation. We also had something about down with Milei, but some at that point didn't think it was the time for that. But that was kind of a minor difference. But the huge difference that everybody had with our call, which is basically for a government of the working class and the left, and specifically the union confederations that have a significant portion of the workforce, which is the CGT, and there are 2 CTA confederations, together with the FITU. And this was not well received at all. It was...
What's wrong with the government of the left and the working class?
Well, we actually had a number of arguments kind of from both sides of the question. The left didn't like this call because it's a call for a government based on the union federations, and the union federations are currently led by sellout traders. And so the argument is these are pro-capitalist leaders, therefore our call is for a popular front or a bloc with a wing of the bourgeoisie, a political bloc, which would be unprincipled. However, the whole point of our leaflet was that there needs to be a fight by communists in the unions to oust the existing bureaucracy and replace them with a leadership that actually will fight for workers' interests. So the whole idea of a government of the trade unions and the left is that you would actually, first of all, have a government. It has a non-parliamentary dynamic. So it's based on the unions, and it's not simply like a social democratic parliamentary opposition, but also include the left parties and have, like, what it needs to have is a revolutionary program. So from the left, that was the main argument that was made, is it includes this, the unions are led by reactionaries, so you cannot have any kind of unity with them. And as Leticia explained, that goes to the extent of having large demonstrations on separate days. The demonstrations will either be called by the unions with a very small presence from the left, or vice versa. They'll be called by the left with a, pitiful presence of the trade unions. So that really is something that divides the working class and prevents an effective struggle against the government. From the other side of the question, we got arguments from workers who are in these Peronist unions and who object to including the FITU in the call for a trade union FITU government, sometimes because the FITU is very parliamentary and focused on elections, but most of the time because workers tell us that they have a very negative experience of the FITU party's actual work in the unions, because many of them put forward calls to form what I would describe as parallel unions or more combative unions. So to split away from the main union federations and form union federations that actually will fight for workers' interests. However, they do so by dividing the most militant and combative workers from the rest of the working class and leave the bulk of the workers under the leadership of the existing Peronistas. And so what we hear from those workers in the Peronist unions is the left divides the unions. They don't want to fight alongside with us. And so for that reason, they object to including the FITU.
I mean, it's a fair point on part of the workers in the trade unions, because I think our difference with that strategy is that communists should actually be fighting to run the unions, not create multiple other unions.
Exactly.
That do in fact divide the working class. So that's a fair point again, but they both I think arrive at the wrong conclusion, which is let's not make a united front. And I think the other thing is it's really seeing a reality as static. Okay, we have this call, but it's not as if the CGT, CTA, and the FITU are just going to get together and be like, okay, let's go. It requires an actual struggle. And that struggle comes from a political perspective of look, Argentina is being dragged to hell by Milei, so we need to fight. So how do you actually advance that struggle by drawing a basic class line and fight against imperialism? Well, you have to fight within these unions to make them fight for the government, make them sort of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Right. And that's really what that leaflet that we just talked about, Wake Up, was about, and that call for a government of the workers and the left. I had a very heated debate with a member from one of the FITU organizations the other day in Corrientes, where she was telling me that our call for that government was class collaboration. And it was kind of, it's a very rigid kind of view of how things can actually change. So she argued that first you had to get unions that were led by revolutionaries, and then, maybe you could make this call. But the whole point about this call is to win over the workers in these unions so that they actually fight for a different leadership. It's not like we have any illusions that the current leaders of these confederations are likely to actually fight for these things. But the point is to raise the things that mean something to people that they really want to fight for, and actually give a perspective of how you could carry that out. And it's through that kind of intervention that you could, win workers away from their current leadership and their Peronista leanings and that, because they will, in the struggle, see that their leaders aren't doing this, which actually seems quite logical if you think about it. You have these huge organizations and everybody says they're all for all of these things. So, how come the wind isn't in our direction?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said, communists have to fight to appeal to the things that make sense to ordinary people, that animate the masses, So they want to struggle against Milei. So let's put forward a perspective that will animate them, that will make them see that, okay, there is a third option. It doesn't have to be just the Peronist candidates or or Milei, but that there is a proper alternative. And in the course of that struggle to expose the illusions that might exist, to actually build the unity of the working class in order to push the struggle forward, So,
yep.
Okay. I wanted to ask, so as we said at the start, it's been 2 years, midterms just happened. You guys have just spent some time there in Buenos Aires. What is the current state of things? What do you see as kind of next? The world situation is turning. Things are not looking good for the economy, for the working masses. Attacks are on the horizon. What do you kind of see as what's on the horizon, or in terms of tasks?
Well, the horizon doesn't look very promising in Argentina, simply because in the midterm elections, Milei won a fairly decisive victory, including in the province of Buenos Aires, which traditionally hasn't, the neoliberals haven't run. What this means is that he's got a much more decisive majority in the parliament, and the next step that he's proposing is a reform to the labor law to basically try to attack union rights, collective bargaining, and break down negotiations by company, and try to increase the amount of precarious, temporary, and informal work, as opposed to sort of organized full-time, semi-decent jobs. And the problem is the absence of a real fight against him in the last 2 years has really enabled him to do this. So there really needs to be a change of course from both the unions and the left if this situation is to be reversed.
Right. And I assume they're continuing on their same course as they have been.
They are. So far they are. So
no lessons learned so far.
And, I think one indication of the kind of the problem is that the FITU, for example, ran in these elections, the Trotskyists, but they only got 3.9% of the vote. So despite the sellout of the existing Peronista leadership, they are not considered by the working class as a viable alternative to their existing leadership. So questions have to be asked here in the Trotskyist organization. Something else has to be done. And for the reasons we laid out above, the existing strategy they have is not working.
Okay, cool. The other thing I want to talk about is you both recently went to a women's conference in Argentina. And from what I've heard, it was very exciting. And I'm really curious to hear more. So tell us about this women's conference that drew apparently thousands and thousands of women.
Yeah. It was in the province of Corrientes in the northeast of the country over 3 days last weekend. It's not exactly a conference. It's though they call it a gathering, an encuentro. And there's a big opening rally, closing rally, and in between there's all sorts of events. There were 2 marches, one against the killings of lesbians, trans people, and other gender diverse people. There was the march of kind of the whole event. There were 112 workshops, all sorts of different subjects. Julia says 116. I didn't count them myself, but from everything from healthcare to union organizing, sexuality, problems confronting youth, assuring abortion rights, global issues, and anti-imperialism. And they said they were expecting 70,000 people that had registered, I guess. I don't know the exact numbers, but it was pretty big. This is something that's first started in 1986 with an encuentro gathering in Buenos Aires of about 1,000 people and 21 workshops. So it's grown significantly now into the tens of thousands usually. And it was just a gathering of women initially. It is now also includes lesbians. The name includes women, lesbians, trans people, bisexuals, intersex, and non-binary people. And also now includes specifically indigenous populations as recognized in the title. So these were things that were added into the name, and there had been tensions at different points when these things were added. Like, for instance, when it was just a women's gathering, then there was an effort to include trans people and others also. And the tensions at the events themselves, which this is the first year we've been, so we don't have any direct experience from previous ones, but they reflect the tensions in society. It's a question of limited resources, and women feel like they've fought for rights and social gains and such. And I guess they thought that if, you're going to include other groups, that's where are the resources going to come from except being taken away from them. It seemed there are no more tensions there. Also on the question of adding specifically indigenous population or indigenous women, I guess the feeling was that takes away from it being a women's event in particular, but really indigenous women even have further burdens, and not just as women. Certainly it strengthens the movement if they are also part of it and there is unity of all of these different sectors.
Yeah, for sure. Would you say that generally this is like a feminist event? I don't know what feminism looks like in Argentina or Latin America.
It's most definitely a feminist event.
Okay.
Everybody calls themselves
Like
feminists. Yes, it is.
Okay, cool.
It is it's so the politics are very, the attendance, first of all, was probably about 99% women. That includes women from middle class, from working class, and from peasant backgrounds, including also indigenous backgrounds. So it's quite impressive in that sense that literally tens of thousands of women from everywhere around the country come together to talk politics for 3 days. That aspect
That's so cool.
is very interesting. However, the actual politics of the event is dominated by feminist politics, which includes, this is pushed largely by the Peronistas, who are feminists at the same time, who've kind of adopted the same kind of feminist ideologies that you see coming from, the liberals in the United States, etc. So examples of that would be sort of pushing the idea that what we need to do is fight machisto ideas in men's heads, or that we need to fight for a more inclusive language as a way to liberate trans people, and also that we need to fight for better legislation for women's rights, which of course we'd be in favor of. But the problem is, like, in the current social context, it's not going to make a qualitative difference to women's conditions. So yes, those politics were very much dominant in the event. The question really for communists is intervening into that with a revolutionary program, really counterposing yourself to those kinds of politics and pushing the need for a united fight based on the working class to actually fight for dramatic improvements in the social conditions of all working people in the country.
Yeah. Basically that the liberation of women and other oppressed peoples is not going to come through an ideological struggle, but through the material struggle between classes. I think that's the main beef we have with the feminist approach, worldview. But you had mentioned to me earlier that there's a bit of a contradictory character to this event.
There is a contradictory character.
What do you mean that?
What does that mean? This event is a real gain for women. To give you a sense, a lot of the women who attend these events are coming to a political event for the first time in their lives. The workshops are largely, sort of devolved into different groups, different subjects. And a lot of the women who speak in these, everybody has a chance to speak, everybody is heard. And a lot of the women who participate are speaking in public for the very first time. For a lot of them, it's a chance to get away from their domestic tasks of caring for their children, cooking, looking after the family, leaving that aside for 3 days and come together in a context where they can talk politics and they can also learn to sort of develop strategies to rely on their own strengths to fight for their material interests. So it does really, the people whom we met who've been to these gatherings year after year say that it really does help sort of increase women's consciousness of their own strengths and their own possibility to fight back in a society where quite often everything is decided in a very patriarchal manner, in the family, or, the bosses obviously tend to be, more men, or, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really is sort of a counterposition to that. But on the other hand, as we've said, the political perspective that's being put forward, it reflects the problems that we've already discussed of sort of looking for solutions through, tweaks to the laws, through the judicial, through the election of a Peronista government in 2027. And so there was a really felt need for struggle. But on the other hand, there were very few real solutions on offer.
There's also an important point about how the mobilizations that led to legislation legalizing abortion for these feminist movements in 2021, abortion was made legal up to 14 weeks. Argentina is one of only a couple of 2 or 3, I think, countries in Latin America where that's the case, that there's national legislation on that. And this is something that's really, I think really motivates women. And it's like being put on the chopping block, because if you're cutting all healthcare, like Milei is doing, and gutting hospitals and stuff, that obviously puts into question that gain for women.
Yeah, I'd say that was an overwhelming theme that we found at the event, was women talking about how Milei's attacks are directly impacting on their daily lives. So one major question that probably has been reported internationally as well is the level of domestic violence in Argentina and the question of killings of women. So far, there have been 210 killings of women this year in Argentina, and most of those are victims of domestic violence. Now, what's the link with what Milei's government is doing is that issues like housing shortages and rent inflation make it much harder for women who are victims of domestic violence to actually seek a way out. So, like, to give you an idea, like, today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And one of the national newspapers features an article that explains, for example, that there's a program that exists in Argentina called the Acompañar program, which provided psychological, social, and economic support to women and LGBT people fleeing domestic violence, equivalent to basically the minimum wage for a period of 6 months, which allowed women to escape from an abusive situation and try and find their feet again and sort of escape the abusive relationship. And in 2023, there were over 100,000 women and LGBT people who availed themselves of those services, but they've been drastically cut. So in 2024, that drops to 3,500, and this year there have been none, according to the newspaper. So that is really sort of forcing women to stay in very abusive relationships. And everybody agrees that there's been a dramatic rise in domestic violence because everybody is feeling the squeeze of the economic conditions. You know, the solution, obviously you have, it is in the family, is there's a lot of, it leads to a lot of violence and a lot of blowback that really impacts more strongly on women. So that was a theme of a lot of what people were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it boils down to, like, to fight to advance women's conditions, you have to address the underlying material conditions. And I think the thing I wanted to say, and bringing it back a little bit to the left and the Peronistas and the fight against Milei, I just want to plug an article we wrote this year? Yeah, earlier this year. It's the back page of our journal Women Revolution, which is about anti-imperialism and the fight for women's liberation. That really, you know, the fight to, you know, defend the country against imperialism is so intertwined with the fight to, like, defend women's conditions, advance them, anything. You know, you cannot, like, feminism is such an utter dead end when you're talking about the global south. Like, I have patience for that maybe in, like, some countries in the West. But when you're talking about countries of the global south that are so devastated by imperialist, you know, just everything, then you know, parade around like, oh, well, we're just going to go fight machismo and, like, you know, get the guys to be a little bit nicer and so on and so forth. Like, it's a total dead end. You really have to make the fight for women's liberation. You really have to make anti-imperialism central to that as well. So in that sense, you know, you really, if you're going to fight Malay, you know, one of our articles said fight for national liberation, but also to fight for women's liberation. It's the same question. So I just wanted to plug that article.
Well, actually, what we found is that both of the articles that you just mentioned were extremely popular on the demonstrations and you know, in the rallies that we attended here, because we have both of those in Spanish. And just the headlines really were extremely attractive to women because there was a real thirst at this event for political answers. And we found that, for example, our headline for national liberation, or, you know, for the struggle against imperialism, really intersected a felt sentiment of the women who were there. Everybody knows that the problems in Argentina are due to the foreign strangulation of the country by the United States in particular. And so they were really looking for answers. And to be honest, what their existing leadership is offering is simply not up to the task. The thing is, like, in general, you know, you like, we Marxists sort of say that the status of women is generally an indication of the level of development in a given society, i.e. that you would expect in a country where social conditions are being totally devastated by the government, that's not going to lead to progress for women. And the only way to actually fight for such improvement in women's conditions is to fight against the the economic strangulation of the country by imperialism and the attacks by Milei and the domestic bourgeoisie against the working class as a whole. So the solution is for women must fight alongside men, in particular in the unions, which were very heavily represented at this event, which is a good thing, to struggle against the oppression by the current government.
Yeah, for sure. Very nicely put. Okay, any other impressions from the conference?
Continuing on the point that you were making about the struggle for women's liberation in the neo-colonial world or the global South, and how that has to be linked, obviously, to the unions, the working class. We chose the union organization, a workshop to attend. And the presence there was several people from Pan y Rosas, Bread and Roses, which is a organization associated with the PTS, and also women from several different unions and different parts of Argentina who tended to be Peronistas. And so everybody would speak against Milei, against the attacks. Nearly everybody talked about the need for unity and for fighting together. So after a while, I intervened to ask, well, what are the obstacles to fighting Milei and fighting these attacks that everybody wants to fight? So then kind of the lines were drawn a little bit in the workshop. So for instance, one woman from a union who is a Peronista, she complained about the person from Pan y Rosa talking against Peronism, but not recognizing why workers and women, might think that the gains that were won under Peron were a good thing. And she insisted that you do need unity. You have to maintain clarity about the main enemy. And so I think it kind of was showing how she was also motivated by anti-imperialism. Another woman was really angry because she said, this is a woman from a union. She said, well, we go out into the streets and the left just howls against us. So it kind of gets back to the point about how are you actually going to win workers, not, go out and denounce them, basically. Another criticism that they had was that about the left is that what Julia had spoke about earlier, about how they lose a vote in a union, so they basically look for some way to make some parallel union or get around it, or look for in some way act to separate parts of the union. And that really infuriates people. And a woman who was sitting next to me, she turned to me and she said, you asked about the obstacles? Well, there it is. When you don't recognize why people care about labor gains and stuff, that's what separates us. And then there was this whole screaming match from the two sides because one woman from Pan y Rosas and one of the Peronista women were from the same union. And so they were arguing about whether or not their union was democratic or not. But the way the end of that workshop was with the Peronista woman really insisting no to the fragmentation of the union. So that is their view of what the left does to the union. And yes, we have to be against the fragmentation of the union. So it's obviously just weakens them.
It's the best way to discredit the left. If the left are seen as people who disorganize the labor movement, I mean, what better way to just discredit themselves?
Exactly.
I think that's...
For communists, there's really no substitute to fighting in the existing unions to win its leadership. And yes, you're going to lose votes at certain times, but you need to fight to be the militants who are actually going to be seen to systematically fight to advance the interests of workers. The workers will learn both from negative experiences and from positive experiences. But the desire for unity of the unions is something we have to support 100%. And without that, there will be no effective fight against the government. So that sentiment is progressive. And the left's attempt to disorganize that and go around it, or promote other sectors as the vanguard, such as retirees or, students or, petty bourgeois movement. Nothing against those movements, but really it's the working class that has the power to shut the country down.
Absolutely. I think that's a nice way to sum up, I think, one of the tasks that we see for ourselves in terms of fighting against Milei, fighting for national liberation in Argentina. Okay, I've run out of questions in terms of what's going on in Argentina. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to add to our conversation before we call it?
I think we've covered the main points.
Yeah, we've gone from Buenos Aires to Corrientes and back.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you both very much for helping us to understand what's going on. I did want to say, I didn't get the chance to say this during our discussion, but if anybody was to read anything about Argentina and the fight against Milei from the press of another left group, you would not get this view.
No, you wouldn't. No.
They think it's been quite rosy, quite good, and just onwards and upwards. So,
or even when it's not, even when they think maybe it's not quite as rosy, they still think the answer is just, go out into the streets, unity, and there's really, other than denouncing the Peronistas, no real perspective of how you are going to win the working class to a revolutionary perspective away from their current traitorous leaderships.
Precisely. So if any of our listeners were wondering about Argentina, they're on the left, then it's time to draw some lessons about the first 2 years of Milei and what the Trotskyist left hasn't been able to do right and how to go forward. And we encourage you to read the articles, which I'll link in the show notes, both in Spanish and in English. So once again, thank you, comrades. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.